So thank you all so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate it. Ya and I are speaking from unceded Ho-Chunk territory in an area that is known as Dejop, has been known as Dejop since time immemorial, and is now known as Madison. And as we all know, land acknowledgements can mean both something and absolutely nothing. So I wanted to note that we use the land acknowledgements in an effort to start a conversation about continued settler colonialism. We're in a special place in that it is unceded. The languages, the conversations that happen around unceded territory are slightly different than those that happen in areas that have been ceded, usually almost entirely under force anyway. But I just wanted to start off our conversation with a recognition of where we are physically right now, and the spaces we're talking about and the conversations that we need to have about settler colonialism as larger systems. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Ya to start us off.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you all for being here. We look forward to going through some of this work with all of you. So as most of us in this Zoom room know, Sub-Saharan Africa faces some of the most extreme impacts of global climate change and environmental degradation. And in many of these places, young people are positioned as extremely vulnerable to the negative consequences of these changes. And so as a response, school has been expected to play a central role in education for mitigation and adaptation and sustainable development. But many critical development and many education scholars have started to argue that schools are poorly structured and organized in ways that might not help them play the kinds of positive roles in climate and environmental change, given their colonialist roots, policies, and practices. Next slide, please. The curriculum analysis that we will be presenting today is one part of a larger study that we conducted that was mapping the two-way relationship between climate change and education by conducting youth-centered research in two countries that are heavily impacted by climate change, so Ghana and Malawi. And for this study, we conducted a range of data collection, ethnographic data collection, and analytical activities to try and understand this relationship in a multifaceted manner. So this included interviews with teachers and students and parents and guardians and local leaders. And of course, the curriculum piece, which you will hear about today. So in this piece, we set out to examine the content of Ghana and Malawi's official grade 8 curricular materials, in particular to explore how these materials conceptualize human-earth relations, how they think about climate change, in order to understand, how current curricula might support or undermine sustainable development or global justice efforts. So today, what I'm going to do is first explain the political ecological framework that we centered our analysis around, and then Nancy and I will present some of the key findings from our curriculum study. Next slide, please. So overall, our study came into contact with many different actors, many levels, many systems. And so for us, political ecology emerged as a way to respond to that and to think about, how are we going to grapple with the interactions between all of these spaces and actors. And as a field, political ecology emerged as a reaction to a couple of things. First of all, it's responding to the sort of erasure or the neglect of important historical context and contemporary socio-political dimensions of various human environment interactions, which is what we're seeing in a lot of dominant framings of the environment and of the changes or the crisis described within that. The second thing that is tied to these decontextualized framings is that we're also seeing an overwhelming focus on the human, and underneath that, or resulting from that, a focus on the human solely as an individual, right? So at its core, political ecology is arguing for a more critical study of the relationships between all the historical, political, economic, social factors that need to be present in any analysis of the environment, right? And of environmental change within that response, right? The field is making a call to move away from these sort of dehistoricized or depoliticized, and again, anthropocentric analysis, and make room for more holistic representations of people, of non-human and non-living actors, of systems, and what we think is quite significant, sort of a recognition of power, right? How it's characterized, how it moves through, how it connects all these different actors and spaces. Next slide, please. So what happens when we sort of apply political ecology as an education lens more specifically? Well, we found that we're able to interrogate the education space in very significant ways for our analysis, right? First, we're able to point to education itself's focus on developing individual skills, on maintaining economic priorities, which is very common in an international development context, right? And even when it's making a case for the environment or trying to figure out our response to change. Then we can also think about how this developmentalist approach actually stipulates very little concern for non-human and non-living actors and isn't so concerned with examining our relationship to them outside of sort of utilitarian and dominionistic earth views. And then thirdly, we're able to have a conversation about the various political economic systems, again, both historical and contemporary, that shape education programs, how education programs are funded, how knowledge is politicized, and how these spaces or how these contexts impact teaching and learning about human-earth relations and the development of curricula. So to summarize, as an education lens, more specifically within a conversation about environmental change, a political ecological framing has allowed us to sort of probe some of the ontological and political logics that determine, how human-earth relations are conceptualized, and so how curriculum and learning issues around these programs are framed. And we think that it problematizes some of the, simplistic, decontextualized explanations of the impacts of environmental change, and then the similarly sort of decontextualized explanations of what we're seeing in our climate response or in our environmental response. So I'm now going to introduce the curriculum analysis we did. Next slide, please. We organized our analysis around the question of, how human-earth relations are portrayed. And to do this, we looked at the graded curricula that were used in the focal schools that formed our ethnographic study across several subject areas, including science, English, religion, social studies, agriculture, English, and so on. And in our analysis, we focused on three questions, three themes in particular. First one is how human-earth relations are portrayed and discussed. And then secondly, how the curriculum explains the causes of climate and environmental change. And then thirdly, who or what is presented as responsible for responding to these changes. And the curriculum analysis was done through multi-person open and closed coding, several inter-rater reliability tests, and content spot checks. Next slide, please. So, next slide, please. Okay, so going back to what I mentioned about political ecology, remember it's very concerned about framing the context. And so before doing a content analysis of the curriculum, a political ecological analysis almost requires that we sort of do a context analysis, right? What is the context within which these curricula have emerged, right? We can't do an analysis that says, here's what the texts say, without considering, what is the role of the state? How is the education funded? What do the texts actually look like? And these analyses we think are just as essential for understanding, why the texts read as they do, how available they are or not, and what they represent within broader educational, economic, and political context. So, for instance, really briefly, I want to share how in both Ghana and Malawi, these are centralized education systems that are modeled on the colonial British model of high stakes exam systems, right? So the textbooks are going to represent an official statement from the state about how youth should understand the environment, how you should understand the world around them. For instance, in Ghana, we see a consistent articulation within these framings of economic development as the guiding purpose of the citizen, right? And in Malawi, a similar development goal is often framed through, conversations around individual entrepreneurship and self-reliance. So recognizing this, for instance, right, leads us to an important analysis of, colonial processes with the modeling, with the way the education system modeled, and various neo-colonial and capitalist logics that are shaping, what development is supposed to look like in these countries. next slide, please. What about, how they're formatted, right? So what the textbooks look like matter for us in thinking about how they are framing human earth relations, right? So the Ghanaian textbooks, for instance, that we examined as part of the curriculum contained very detailed factual information, a lot of multi-phase analysis of scientific processes, including those related to climate and environmental change. So in theory, the curriculum is student-centered. It's meant to facilitate, learning and active participation, but the activities that are included in the curriculum, in the textbooks, as you see in the slide here, there appears to be very little exploration of practical work or experiential learning or hands-on learning. Instead, there's a focus on memorization, on reflective thinking, on test-taking approaches that students might find useful. So you see that information is often provided in the form of bullet points or numbered lists, such as what is depicted in the lesson on air pollution and carbon and the carbon cycle on the left, right? So basically, the focus is on preparing students to pass an exam. Unlike the Ghanaian textbooks, the Malawian textbooks are quite brief. The science textbook, for instance, is only about 40 pages long. The Ghanaian equivalent is over 200 pages. And so the Malawian textbook is organized into very short units, usually 2 or 3 pages. Each unit has a short introduction and a set of activities for students to participate in. So it's definitely more hands-on than the Ghanaian textbooks. However, it's often asking students to brainstorm problems, to think about ideas, to come up with materials, and rarely provide the texts, the curriculum themselves rarely provide information about the topic at hand. So it results in making sort of what we think are unrealistic demands on students and teachers, and appear to relay the message that each student, each teacher are responsible for sourcing their own information however they can. As you see, there's an example here about building a fish pond sort of assumes that students and teachers will come together to do that with the resources and the interests that they have. So knowing this, right, now that we know what underlies the curriculum, what it looks like, what does it actually say, right? And I'm gonna turn over to Nancy to remind us of our framing.
Thank you, yeah. So just a quick reminder of the 3 questions that shaped this particular analysis of these textbooks and curricular, we had teacher books and so forth as well. Next slide, please. The first theme that we'd like to pull out then is related to this question of how are human-earth relations portrayed in the textbooks. And across all of the textbook materials and curricular materials, there was a very clear focus on the earth existing for human use. All curricula consistently represent the non-human world only in relation to its value for humans. So to the extent that value can be extracted from the non-human world, individuals should manage and improve and extract those resources to develop their own, in the case of Malawi, or the country's, in the case of Ghana, wealth. So totally economically focused. All of the textbooks therefore normalize the assumption that the Earth's commons exist for human use and manipulation, exist for whichever humans are able to claim it correctly, use it appropriately in this developmentalist manner, and that the value of the non-human living lies only in their utility to human development efforts. So that which is outside of human interest, for example, is rarely mentioned, and when it is often mentioned very briefly in passing and not always in very positive terms. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so can you go back one slide? I just want to show. Yeah, so what you can see, this is an example. We pulled it out for those of you who can read, but you can see, for instance, in a Ghanaian social studies textbook, it informs students or tells students that fish are a very important food source because it provides protein, and fishing is an important industry, because it's a source of income for many people. And there's another example that discusses mining practices by talking about how minerals that are mined are very important to Ghana's economy. And gold is useful because it's a foreign exchange earner, and similar with cocoa and timber. So all of these, extractive practices, in discussing all of these practices, the texts make no mention, no reference to potential or ongoing environmental implications of industrial fishing or large-scale timber farming or or mining, including pollution and decimation of water resources, for instance.
Next slide, please. Similarly, in Malawi, we see very similar language being used to talk about non-human resources of all sorts. And I'd like to draw your attention particularly to the third example here. Cattle are important because they're a source of food, employment, income, raw materials, and manure. In her work on self-devouring growth, anthropologist Julie Livingston reminds us of the very complex ways in which humans in this region have evolved alongside co-species like cattle. She examines the spiritual and the health damage of development approaches that strip this understanding of relationality from us, and spends a lot of time talking about the really complex ways in which art and cultural practices and social relations and dynamics worked with and through people's relationships with cattle up until very, very recently. And she asks in part how it is that such very long-standing logics can so rapidly change. One partial answer, we think, is through curricular foci like this, which turn cattle into nothing more than a product. Next slide, please.
So our next question then, was looking at, then what are the texts actually saying about environmental change? Because we're noting spaces where we're not seeing a lot of those connections being emerged. And what we in our analysis we found was that across both texts there is an understanding that environmental change is happening, that it is being driven by humans and their actions. And there is also some mention of how consequences will be significant, and that there needs to be an attention to management and mitigation by humans to ensure individual and national well-being. But if we look in Ghana, for instance, a lot of this is explained mostly through a scientific framework. So students will learn about the science of global warming or the science of water conservation. And when we see an explanation or analysis of ecologically destructive actions, a lot of the times it's limited to the action and without any reference to any actors that might be partaking in that. So for instance, on this slide, we learn about, or students are learning about, burning wood or tree felling or CFCUs, but a lot of this is listed independent of any actors, individual or otherwise.
Next slide, please. We see something very similar in the Malawian curriculum, although there's a slight change in how the processes of climate and environmental change are discussed. While in Ghana, this is almost entirely presented in the passive voice, trees are felled. In Malawi, there's a very strong focus on small scale individual actions, such as cutting trees for firewood. Very strong focus on local actors and the damage that they're doing, the ways that they are causing climate and environmental change, and absolutely no discussion of actors outside of the local scale, no discussion of the state, no discussion of international actors, corporate actors, and so forth. Next slide, please. So the third theme that emerged was around this issue of responsibility. Who or what is responsible for addressing these changes that are occurring? And in both countries, these changes are extraordinarily visible. Malawi right now, for example, is in the grip of a heat wave that has lasted about 3 weeks. The average temperature at night in Chikwawa, one of the areas in southern Malawi where I work, is about 91 degrees with very little access to electricity or other mechanisms for cooling. Obviously, very significant problems with water access increasing day by day. So this is a very felt set of questions and conversations and thoughts about so what can be done. And we see a number of really important kind of political ecological themes reflected in the way that the curricula discusses these materials. There's a hyper individualizing responsibilization in which individuals are told that they're responsible for changing personal behaviors. The curricula are kind of contradictory in the way that they talk about this. People are definitely told to stop doing certain things, which we might think of as mildly damaging to the environment, like cutting trees for firewood because there's a lack of another form of fuel. But at the exact same time, they're told to adopt new practices that are much more damaging, such as large-scale monocrop farming as the ideal for what people should be doing. And all of this is in the name, of course, of spurring development. So in contrast to this hyper individual responsibilization, state and corporate actors are either entirely absent, as in Malawi, or they're actually largely valorized for driving economic development through environmentally destructive practices. Both the actual large-scale drivers of climate change that we know quite well and the global systems of inequity that drive them are entirely absent from both curricula. Next slide, please. So in Ghana, for example, as Yas said earlier, there's a very strong focus on kind of scientific understandings of both natural resources and the processes by which they are being transformed, and a focus on harnessing these processes and these resources to develop both their families, but more particularly kind of Mother Ghana. There's a focus on the individual's need to adopt these practices only, so there's no discussion of kind of larger, for example, state-led processes. And there's no discussion of the tension between these issues, these questions of sustainability and these questions of development, although the tensions are quite evident in the curricula itself. Next slide, please. In contrast to that kind of tension given to people to engage in particular ways, corporations and their evidently destructive actions are often valorized as solutions to lagging development, and the consequences of these solutions to development on climate and environmental change are completely disappeared, as in this example about plantations where they're lauded for providing jobs and building things like schools. Next slide, please. In contrast, as we said earlier, in Malawi, there's very little focus on national development and a very strong focus on kind of entrepreneurial development. Individuals are held responsible throughout the curriculum for responding to climate change by halting what are described as negative individual traditional actions, we'll talk about that for a second, and adopting positive modern ones, such as the use of a solar heater here. There's a very strong reliance in the curriculum on human improvisation with no additional resources. So how do you make things work with really nothing available to support efforts to innovate and transform? And as we said earlier, there's no state role in this. Next slide, please. Both the Ghanaian and the Malawian curricula consistently message, and this is the tension we were discussing earlier, that a modern, educated, prosperous life means participating in more efficient and scientific forms of production, such as monocropping or livestock improvement, and the consumption of modern labor-saving goods like refrigerators that are readily available, usually only in urban areas. The curricula further position individuals as responsible for adopting these modern and environmentally less sustainable, and the curricula note that they are environmentally less sustainable technologies in order to develop family and country. The emphasis on modernization and technology is directly juxtaposed in the curricula with these presumably unproductive or less productive and superstitious traditional subsistence practices. So in this way, both curricula consistently elide or denigrate practices that people may have developed over millennia to live with the earth and their fellow co-species in more sustainable ways. So we'd like to provide a quick example of this because we think it's really one of the more powerful things that the curricula do. This is an edict given, a case study of the people of Zare and Dulugu. And the curriculum says, right before this case study, superstition prevents the growth of scientific development. Superstition reduces people's ability to solve problems for themselves. Superstition leads to human rights abuses. Have you heard any stories or seen any films which encourage superstitious beliefs? And then right below this is the case study, which says, the people of Zare and Dulugu are forbidden from eating goat meat. It's believed that if any person from these two villages eats goat meat, they must immediately seek medication from the chief of Zare or they will go blind. Why will they go blind? Because during a period of quote unquote tribal conflict, a fleeing family left behind a blind elderly man. A goat is said to have licked the blind man's eyes and he immediately regained his sight. After hearing of this, the chief heard how the man regained his sight and was helped by the goats and assembled his elders to discuss the issue. They created a directive that no person would eat goat meat, and this directive was put into force and it remains in force today. So this example of co-species helping one another is turned into an incredibly dangerous superstition that has to be called out as such and viewed as leading to human rights abuses. Next slide, please. So as we think over what we've seen across the curricular in this content analysis, we think that there's a lot of room within international development and sustainable development education to fight for more curricular information about non-local causes of climate and environmental change, national frameworks for accountability, and our best science to date on mitigation and adaptation in low-income communities. We also think there's a lot of space for much deeper localization and contextualization of the brief information that is provided, and the possibility of colonialist audits to remove or at least call out some of this dominionist, anti-indigenous, anti-traditional material that is particularly prevalent in the Ghanaian curriculum. More space for non-human and non-living logics and relations with humans, such as cultural ecological approaches would offer. And much more focus on the historical political explications of climate change drivers and consequences that would allow the curricula to hold powerful actors and institutions to account for their actions. Beyond international development and sustainable development education, we think it's essential to think, and therefore bring into IDE, a center kind of centering marginalized, which are often indigenous or animist, onto epistemologies, spiritual frames, environmental actors beyond the human, and environmental wisdoms. And of course, in almost every community, these are readily available to be drawn on or can be drawn on with a little bit of work and respect. The creation of new partnerships for knowledge generation and whole world survival tactics, an increase in land-based pedagogies and storytelling about alternative earth views, both in and outside of school settings, and support for community movements and efforts to change human earth mindsets in ways that align more closely with what we know are life-saving, life-sustaining practices. Thank you very much.
I just want to say wow, and then we can move to the Q&A. This was wonderful. Thank you so much, Nancy and Ya. I was captivated. I was like, this is wonderful. So if we were in a real room, everybody will clap now. And I see some people clapping in a virtual setting as well. So thank you so much. I have a lot of questions, but I know others have as well. So let's start with others, and then I'll introduce mine. So let's take 8-10 minutes for Q&A. So if you want to ask a question, why don't you use your hand virtually or manually, and I'll call you up. And try to have short, concise questions so we have more people joining in. Who would like to start? Okay, I see bright flame.
I just want to basically thank you, Nancy and Ya, for the presentation. I think your focus is on the exact right things. I mean, I'm biased a little bit because I share the important framing that you're doing. I think decolonizing curricula around the world, putting the emphasis back on humans being part of the living world, not separate and lording over the human world, is a really important way forward to sustainability and a just and regenerative future. So it's not really a question, but I'm also going to throw a reference to an article I wrote that you all might be interested in that goes kind of a deep dive into some of that stuff. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Bright Flame. Any other question?
And maybe I'll just make one quick note. Thank you so much for that comment. And one of the things that we just didn't have time to talk about as much today as we would have liked is to clarify that this analysis of these two curricula is meant to provide an analysis of what a lot of students in two of the most heavily climate affected countries in the world, a lot of what they're hearing officially about how to understand the changes that are going on and their own responsibility for it. But they are not hearing those messages because of straightforward reasons or straightforward relations of power. So one of the things that we wanted to be very clear about is that the political ecological framework is important to us in part because it allows us to recognize the very complicated ways in which these particular curricular materials are created. And the reasons that particular, for example, dominionist viewpoints are there, and particular developmental viewpoints are there, and particular ways of talking or not talking about those most responsible for climate change. And so it's not easy to imagine curricula that look different in the ways that we're talking about, but we think it's absolutely essential.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Any question from the group? Lisa?
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to look for my virtual hand and I'm not getting it here. Excuse me, I'm a little sick, so if I sound off. I also want to acknowledge, I really love your approach of really looking at the underlying causes of a discourse, right? Like looking at the textbook and, you know, indoctrination in a way. I'm here in California in the US and I'm, you know, really looking at the trial right now on climate change and the companies that are being put on trial for the disinformation campaign, right? So this whole piece of news literacy and, you know, before we could even design curriculum, we have to know what the issues are, what we're up against. So really that was my question is based on your awesome work, like what would you say next steps would be? Because in California, we have an environmental literacy blueprint, which I'll share with all of you, that mitigates some of the issues you were talking about, just with human and environmental relations. But the problem I find as a high school educator is the implementation of it, right? So everything could look good on paper, but what does that look like in the classroom, especially with so many different bureaucracies and ways of knowing and teaching. So
Yeah, Nancy, would you like to respond or?
I don't know if you got my question. I was kind of just talking, but
Can you say the question part again?
yeah, so just wondering, so based on your research, what would you say would be good next steps? What would be your suggestions for next steps?
I can talk a bit because this is where my research is going. So in thinking about the curriculum piece, right, we already sort of nested that within sort of an ethnographic study of changes we think, like, you know, changes going on in communities, what teachers, parents, students themselves are thinking about. But I think one of the ways that we have to talk about curriculum is to also talk about what's not considered curriculum. So if we're doing a curriculum analysis of formal schooling, where else do we see, you know, learning and, you know, socialization around human earth relations happening, and what kinds of conversations can we have about, we know formal schools, you know, are center stage, and we know that they're center stage for a reason, and we know they have, you know, all this power and all this reach, but where else, you know, where else are young people, where else are people forming human earth relations, where else are people, you know, making sense of their relations to the earth, or being, you know, charged with various responsibility notions, because I think, you know, not just with students, but people are moving across various different sort of nodes of you know, social and cultural spaces. And so to sort of center an analysis around, well, here's what schools are doing, or here's what the curriculum is doing, and here's what's so, you know, scary, dangerous, worrying about it. It's useful to have that conversation alongside, you know, are there tensions? Are there tensions happening Are there tensions between schools and other spaces? Are schools being reinforced by other spaces or being sort of challenged by other spaces? And then maybe there's a step 3, but the step 2 is definitely thinking about how do we nest a curriculum analysis or an analysis of schools within an analysis of, other kinds of sort of nodes of education, socialization, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
And to take the other piece of it, the curricular piece of it, I want to just reinforce what Yas said. I think what we'll be able to do through schools, through formal curricular changes, for example, is likely to be relatively limited, right? So we have to be looking for other ways of moving. But in terms of the curricula, the Ghanaian and the Malawian curricula are relatively heavily dependent, in Malawi's case, very heavily dependent, in Ghana's case, relatively heavily dependent on interactions with international bilateral organizations, particularly USAID and DFID, in the construction of new curricular materials. And so that particular process and the ways that curricular reform is practiced in international development education is a lever point that we think also needs to be kind of addressed in different ways by those interested in seeing a different approach to teaching about climate and environmental change. And if I could, I just, David P. asked, would you recommend a decrease in activities proven to cause climate change and an increase in activities that don't cause climate change? And I'd like to take that and just for a second note, we also did an analysis that's not included here on the ESD framework, the UNESCO Education for Sustainable Development framework. One of the things that comes out very clearly in that analysis is that the exact same issues around human-centered dominionism actually kind of run through that quite well. And the framework also really just basically assumes a person living in very wealthy conditions, most likely in Europe or the US, although not necessarily, it's really more about being wealthy and living in a functional democracy, which many of us are not. So that is really significant for thinking about where these issues are coming from and what lever points exist right now for trying to think about alternatives and the ways that we conceive of who needs to do what. So do I recommend a decrease in activities proven to cause climate change by individual students in a rural school in Malawi? Absolutely not. Their carbon footprint is as close to zero as most humans get these days. Do they need to change the activities that prove that? No, absolutely not. The conversations need to be of a very different sort. And we need to take seriously the fact that people are struggling in the ways they're struggling to survive and thrive right now. The messages that need to be given are completely different than the message, from my perspective, than the messages that need to be given to, for example, kids in US schools, which, oh my God. But oh my God, in a very different way.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question before we go to breakout rooms. I see a hand from Sarah Fuller.
Thanks very much, Oren. Thanks to both of you for the presentation. It's really incredible to see this work. I just have a quick question, and maybe it's a bit context specific. But I'm working with countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and many of these countries are still providing guidance to teachers, very top down on exactly how they're expected to implement the curriculum. Teachers have very little autonomy, especially when it comes to enriching the curriculum with experiential learning or with complementary materials. I think you mentioned experiential learning in one of the contexts where you were looking at the curriculum. And I'm just wondering, first, what inroads do you see in contexts where the governments are still very heavily controlling not only the intended curriculum, but also how teachers are implementing it? Maybe if you could share more about the experiential learning components that you noticed in the curricula. And then second, you mentioned the UNESCO ESD framework, how it's reflecting these same challenges. Do you think that partners who quite honestly are still focused on, the so-called sustainable development, often on checking boxes, do you think that they, because they're so closely partnered with governments, can they actually make any difference in this regard?
I can start by talking a little bit about Ghana. Maybe Nancy, I might have to ask for your help with the Malawi example. But so we looked at textbooks. We also looked at teaching guides in the work that we're doing. And I would say, so in Ghana, as far as the sort of strict government control of what or mediation of what teachers do, it's very much driven by, you know, the text of the teaching guides. I mean, including, you know, general teacher training that happens in training colleges, but teachers often get teaching guides that are very similar to what the students see on the text. So it's often like a call and response kind of relationship where it's like teacher is asked to, you know, ask students to do X, or you know, provide a case study of blah, 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 right? And so there's not as much, the rigidity I think that you're describing isn't so much enforced when it comes, you know, going into schools and asking, you know, what are teachers actually teaching? But it is expected that teachers are following some strict sort of scripts that exists in the teaching guide. So there's not, as far as sort of on the follow-up end, you know, checking, making sure that teachers are teaching one thing or another. It's not as rigid or as strict in that sense as it is in the examples that you suggested.
And I would say in Malawi, generally, there are teacher guides. Many teachers don't have them and are using the textbooks as their primary mode of organizing their teaching. The textbooks, the particular textbook that you saw, which has been in use now for quite a long time, was created with support particularly from DFID, and is widely conceived of as being crap. There's a lot of mistakes in it, which is remarkable because there's very little information in it. So it's a very difficult curriculum because it has really good intentions and it's organized in a way that we would all want to see learning organized, but it's organized in a way that has none of the support required for that kind of learning. And so teachers often really struggle because they're not given information that they can use to kind of expand and explore a particular topic or to think about how they want to present it. And because they're usually just working with the textbook, there's very little information about kind of how to approach something pedagogically or in terms of kind of expanding content knowledge. So teachers, for the most part, are doing their best, working with what they have, which tends to mean that there's a small amount of information that becomes kind of reified with the assumption that it may be part of the final exam. So the small amount of information that is provided in the book is often kind of reviewed repeatedly, as also happens in Ghana, with the expectation that it may be what students are tested on. So it's a weird situation because the textbooks carry a fair amount of weight because they're some of the only materials readily available for teachers to use to organize their work. But they're not often given a lot of support in figuring out how to organize it. They may be given directives, but the directives don't have a lot of support behind them. And so people, you know, do what they can to kind of make it work. So I think it's a quite different situation than the little I know about Central Asia in terms of the support and the oversight that teachers receive.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and Nancy, for engaging us with the Q&A. Let's move to small group discussions, Nancy. So we have 22 more minutes, and what I suggest we do is first hear some comments from the different breakout rooms, and then use the rest of the time for additional questions or conversation with the speakers. So room number 1, someone want to report from room number 1? The key points of your discussion?
I think Bright Flame, we're number 1, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I took notes, so I'm the designated scribe, so I'll attempt to try and bring our comments together. It was a great discussion. For the first question, there was a lot of great ideas. What really caught my attention was this talk about peripatetic method, where you walk and talk, the emphasis and need for teachers to take curricula and learning outside the classroom, and also the role of schools as a transformational space, and not just a production line, and allowing for ideas about and perspectives with the ecological and human relation to be unconscious instead of a conscious effort all the time. And so the schools can help support that. Do you want me to keep going with question 2, 3, or how would you like this to go?
If you can give us some highlights of the discussions around all questions, that will be great.
Sure. Okay. So in question 2, there were some great ideas. We thought that, you know, there needs to be more eco-centered growth of foundations and funding for textbooks and curricula in countries that we discussed, and not relying on governmental powers or government agencies, and having like timely curricular review and considering the dynamics of these issues in countries that interact with the rest of the world and learning best practices. And then, you know, deep questioning of US aid and other neoliberalist constructions of what climate change is and the roles of schools in contexts like these. And yeah, so we really kind of centered on this idea of like the development world, neoliberalism, and curriculum development, and questioning that. Bright Flame brought up a great idea or a great example of iSteam model from the University of Washington in Canada, learning in places, and their work could be great to see how that could be learned from in different places too. And then the last question, there was another good example brought up about like how to change behavior, like grading people on their, you know, whether they bring cups to school or not. And small actions and behaviors really matter and should be brought into the classroom. And then Neha brought up a really great point. Sorry for calling you out, Neha, but she said, I think it's important to understand how it affects different people, especially those in environmental justice communities. It can really help put into perspective how people can be adversely affected by climate change. And I just wanted to end it on that note. So those were the highlights.
Okay, thank you so much, Erica. And room number 1. Room number 2 was Erin, Gareth, Moulin, Nancy, Sarah, and Yaron. Somebody want to share some highlights? Don't be shy.
I didn't take notes, so I'm really nervous about misrepresenting my colleagues' wonderful opinions. But yeah, so maybe we can all take a really quick comment each. But yeah, we could have spoken for another few hours. It was such a good conversation, and I suppose just a couple of dichotomies that struck me was one about educating. I think Sarah made this point about how education in sort of more inverted commas developed countries then trickles down to, you know, less developed countries, and how changing one affects changing the other, and about that tension. And there was another tension where we thought, I mentioned about, I suggested teaching kids critical thinking skills and giving them the ability to teach themselves. Whereas I think Nancy made a really good point that, you know, that there needs to be a sort of supportive mechanism for kids as well. We can't just teach them to solve the problem and set them off. So how do you fit that into a really busy curriculum as well? And I've forgotten who, but I think a few of us who have been teachers spoke about the real challenge of fitting in, you know, this kind of teaching in really busy curriculums. So there were a few things that struck me, but there was definitely loads more that was said. So I'd welcome other colleagues in the room to also mention something that I've forgotten.
Thank you, Gareth. Anyone else? Yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. All right. No, we really focused on that first question. And I think another interesting point that came up was this issue of the responsibility that's placed often on schools and teachers when the state actors are not actually taking responsibility to shift the values that are being reflected in the curriculum. So it's put on teachers to make this change. But then someone in the group, Yaron, actually mentioned this different practices for perspective taking. He shared a practice that he used that was very interesting about taking a journey in your mind to the moon to see Earth and to understand what it would be like when the moon was actually used to be conceived as part of the Earth, and then coming back to the Earth to understand kind of the place that we're at now. So just really those perspective taking activities that we can use with students was very helpful.
Great. Thank you so much. Anyone else from this room or? Okay, so last room, room number 3. We had David P, Julie, Laura, Mujida, Ya, Megan. Anyone?
I don't know if I should speak because it's me, but we also mostly focused on the first question. I think we had a really good group. We had people working in, kindergarten, people working in higher ed. We had high school students, and so we really focused on the school question because we sort of pluralize what school, what we mean by school, like what it looks like to think about the high school setting. And then we have people working with teachers, so that's a facet of school that is useful to us. So we spent a lot of time talking about, in that question, there is a structural component. So like, what can schools do, right? Can curriculum have the kinds of, pedagogies, questions, topics, what discipline should they be in, and so on and so forth, early childhood versus higher ed. But then another question within that is, say we get the sort of structural components of what schools can do down, right? We come up with like the most beautiful curriculum piece and teachers are trained in the most amazing way and so on and so forth, then what, right? Like what happens after that, right? So we talked a lot about what it means sort of transform schools to do, the kinds of visionary things that, the other two groups gave some examples, talked about, but what happens when we have the perfect schooling mechanisms and the perfect pedagogical systems? What's the part B of that question, right? In can schools transform education? Can schools transform individuals, structures and societies? And that's where we sort of spent a little bit of time, questioning. We don't have an answer, spoiler, but it was useful for us to make that distinction, though, about when we ask the question of schools, what is the question we're asking there, right? Is it a structural piece, or is it sort of the transformational question? Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to.
Anyone want to join, Julie?
Yeah, I'll add something because we also have to get the students to, I'm sorry, I'm sitting in the dark, conserving electricity to some extent, because we can bring the students to the water, but you got to make the students drink that water. So, it's like, it's one thing to instruct them and educate them, but you also want them to really get like a buy-in to that information so that it, will, actually transform their way of thinking, transform the way of doing things. And I teach at a college level, so it's, I also want them to, do it in such a way that they'll become more of an informed, active citizenry, which, affect the way, that they vote. And you can't do it like in a sledgehammer kind of way. You gotta, I find that you have to sort of let it sort of seep in, so they make their own decisions, and hopefully the right ones. And we left with a sort of sense of optimism. At the very end, we started touching on some of the other questions, and I was reminiscing about even what the changes that I've been seeing, even like in the adolescent, the sort of younger folk, like with Greta Thunberg, like speaking at Battery Park a couple of years back, and a number of other activists that are, from her age group, that, like this next generation, I think really starting to get it, how important this is as an issue.
Okay, thank you so much, Julie. Yes, Nancy.
Gun, do you want to go first?
Yes, I wanted to add on that some of the other components that we talked about was the sense of urgency. So once we bring up the topic of how schools can intervene and take initiative, then how can we ensure that students really take it to heart? And that's primarily what Julie was talking about as well. Really the sense of having a stronger connection to the issue of climate change rather than just seeing it as another thing that we learn in school. And another aspect that was not brought up, but that came to mind was also this the prevalence of like climate anxiety is that once you learn about climate change and all of these issues, there's also a sense of hopelessness because you're not sure what to do next. Sometimes it feels like there isn't much that can be done. And that's also one of, unfortunately, the quote unquote cons of this work is that it's hard to see the outcome. That's primarily what y'all was speaking about on how when we measure quote unquote success of climate education and the implementation of it in schools, how do we measure that success? And if so, why? While we do know what the why is, right? How can we ensure that it's actually getting to them? And school, in my opinion, can absolutely be a transforming place. It's basically our second home for like students. For a lot of students, they spend almost more time at school sometimes than at home. Same thing for teachers. But the question is, while school can be a place to transform thoughts and minds, people are different in how they connect to different issues. So how can we be flexible with the way that we implement it into our curriculum, or rather really into our classrooms, so that it's most effective and so that we can see somewhat of an effect.
Okay, thank you so much. Nancy, going back to you.
So I just wanted to point out a kind of a little bit of a tension that I feel exists in our conversations about the roles of schools, and that is that schools are embedded in the broader social, political, economic structures in which they exist, in which we exist, which are at one of the greatest moments of inequality in the history of human telling. And so I really struggle with this notion of students needing to learn about their place in the system. What I mean by that is having a version of a kind of localized and contextualized approach to learning about these issues that helps people understand what's happening for them in the here and now, and how what's happening for them in the here and now impacts others or doesn't impact others. I struggle with this because for Malawian students, really honestly, what they should get is a curriculum about how they are being screwed over by basically everyone else in the world, right? Like, and then what? And then what does that, what does that do? The alternative is to say, you're at the forefront of trying to survive. Here's the best we can offer you in terms of survival tactics, in terms of the kinds of skills and knowledges that might be useful in that way. If we think about schools as skill-centered areas in some ways, knowledge, skills, attitudes, whatever piece we want to focus on. And that means differentiating. It means doing a really good job of differentiating the different roles that people are playing in actually driving climate and environmental change, and in what, therefore, their responses need to be. That's very at tension with the kind of nationalized and in many cases centralized systems that we have around the world. And then one last quick point related to that, when we think about what it means to introduce, it's not going to happen, but introduce, for example, a revolutionary curriculum in some areas. It should be revolutionary everywhere, although the particular role that one should play in that revolution might differ. But it's very hard to introduce those kinds of curricula. It's very hard, as Ngan said, to introduce the notion that we're in real trouble. And I find that particularly problematic because in many parts of the world that I know, from the US to Malawi to Colombia, faith and religion are really central to kind of figuring out how to feel like it can all stick together and that it can all be okay. But I believe 1000% after this analysis that the entwined valuation of capitalism and, in the countries we happen to be working in, Christianity is really at the heart of what makes it so difficult to imagine schools playing a different role. So I also really feel a tension there with the solution that many people have readily available. And I don't mean to make religion only a tool, but in this case, a solution that people readily have available to kind of make sense of the world is a solution that very often fuels exactly the issues that we're trying to work against.
Thank you, Nancy. We had a session last month with speakers from Chile, looking at education and sustainability there. And there was an interesting comment there that I think speaks to another tension that exists in this area. And that's where people, many people will say schools should teach about the environment because they are trying to put almost the responsibility for solving this problem on teachers and students, rather than taking care of the real source of this issue, which is the capitalist system we live in. It's almost like it's an easy solution, right? Put it on teachers, and then if it doesn't work, blame them. So that was the tension that was mentioned last time, and I think it speaks to the other tension that you brought and others today. But I wanted to ask a question of Nancy and Yaa. It's a question that Daphne and I were chatting about earlier. And it is another tension between the science of climate, the facts that we are trying to convey to people, that seems to be once you introduce it to the curriculum, it's almost suffocating the space for other ways of knowing and engaging with the topic. Because it's really tough to introduce both science and then all of these superstitious, I'm putting superstitious because it came in the textbooks. Others will label it as indigenous knowledge systems, etc. It's really tough to bring the science and additional perspective together, because sometimes there is almost a conflict between them in epistemology, or what does it mean to know in this world. And I wonder if, from your research on these two countries, do you have any suggestions on how to reimagine the relationship between the different ways of knowing around climate in the curriculum? Sorry, that was a very long question.
In my experience in Malawi, at least, and then I'll ask Yaa if she can talk about Ghana, almost every aspect of formal schooling has been used quite deliberately by national and international actors over the last 50 years, but particularly over the last 20 years, to try to decimate alternative earth-making strategies. And again, I think in most cases, it's coming out of particularly a kind of a religious zeal to assure that these approaches that are viewed as viewed negatively in all the ways that animist traditions so often are around the world, that they be removed, that they be excised from the body politic in large part through schools, and not just the curriculum, but the ways that schools are organized. So for example, initiation ceremonies, schools are in Malawi, and we can talk about what you think of initiation ceremonies, but schools in Malawi were originally organized so that the school break happened during initiation ceremonies so that people could kind of follow both. And then finally, the powers that be won enough to say, no, absolutely not. Schools have to triumph over initiation ceremonies, schedule them at the exact same time, and then penalize kids and families who continue these practices. So I think the entire educational system is actually set up to try to work against these alternate knowledges right now. In most places, in most schools, we have beautiful examples from around the world of schools that are organized differently. But Oren, I think your point that there's often a tension, and I don't think it's between science. I do not think science is the issue here, but that there's often this tension between, or there's often an effort on the parts of schools to hold only one, let's call it developmentalist earthview, because that captures so much of the issues around modernization and et cetera. And until we change that, I don't know what's possible in schools. And let me say, I also, I did a lot of work initially around AIDS and sex education, and a lot of sex educators have decided that it's actually better to just work around schools, let schools do as little damage as possible and work elsewise. And to some extent, Ya spoke to that, the need for us to not focus too much on schools, recognizing the limits of what we may be able to accomplish.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, you have the last word.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think half of my words are, and thank you, Bright Flame, for the examples that you gave about, about science as a discipline, science as an epistemological space, not necessarily being sort of the villain in the story, but Nancy, you're right in saying that it has been sort of taken up as, if we sort of prop up science, we can sort of erase, diminish, sort of discredit some of these other spaces. But we know that sort of science as, like Western science, as a framework for, noting urgency. And I mean, people are, do we like the kinds of modeling or the kinds of measurements that happen in science? They're useful in some spaces, they're not useful in every space, but it is useful to think about, we're not doing away with it, right? We're not going to do away with science. Science has led the conversation, for better or for worse, in many different ways, and it's useful to look to these examples. Bright Flame mentioned, some of Robin Kimmerer's work. She's working with plants and seeing that, there are ways to have conversations about, plant sentience and kinship, but also thinking about, medicine, science of medicine, but also the spirituality of medicine. Donna Haraway has some amazing work on like science fiction with kinship. And so I think looking at how we often talk about like best practices in a lot of work, but looking at how like spaces where those conversations have been collaborative and have been cooperative sort of move us away from sort of naming science as the villain, which I think has actually forced us to sort of ignore exactly what Nancy said, right? The processes that are applying science or that are sort of using science to the various benefits of indigenous erasure and developmentalist goals, and then we put the blame on science, but it's the mechanisms and it's the logics that are choosing to apply science as the tool for this kind of erasure, because we've seen the examples where they're quite collaborative and quite cooperative in many ways.
Great. Thank you so much, Ya and Nancy, for joining us this morning. And thank you, everybody, for staying a little bit longer. This was another wonderful session of the workshop. And I would like to thank the speakers and everybody for joining us this semester. We'll send you information about the next session for January 2022. So happy holidays and happy New Year. Nancy, I see you want to say something? No? Okay.
I just wanted to say thank you so much. What a fantastic conversation. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much for joining us, and happy holidays, happy New Year, everybody. See you next year.